She ruled for 44 years. She defeated the Spanish Armada. She became the Virgin Queen, a legend in her own lifetime. But when Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603, the truth is, no one could say exactly what killed her. There was no public autopsy, no official cause of death, no last triumphant words, just a slow, eerie decline, a queen who stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and finally stopped speaking, staring blankly at the wall, until her body simply gave out. But how does a monarch, worshipped by poets and feared by emperors, just slip away? The last days of Elizabeth I are shrouded in a fog of rumor, speculation, and silence. Even her closest advisors didn't know what to tell the public. She had outlived her rivals, her lovers, her friends, and now, history itself seemed uncertain how to let her go. But perhaps the answer lies not in her final days, but in the years leading up to them. Elizabeth's body had carried the weight of a kingdom, but also of a lifetime of emotional scars. She was imprisoned in her youth, nearly executed by her own sister, and forced to survive in a court full of daggers behind every smile. She learned early that to show weakness was to invite death. So when her health began to falter, Elizabeth did what she always had: she concealed it. We know from her wardrobe accounts that, by the 1590s, she was wearing heavier layers. Even in summer, her hands were often gloved, her face thickly painted with lead-based cosmetics. Her teeth were rotting, her appetite was fading, but she smiled for portraits, rode with courtly grace, and held audiences with unwavering poise. What we do know is that in the winter of 1602, something broke inside her. That was the year her closest friend and perhaps only real emotional attachment, Lady Catherine Howard, died. Elizabeth reportedly took it harder than any public defeat she had ever faced. She wept uncontrollably. She refused to eat. She refused to sleep in her bed, standing or lying on cushions on the floor for hours, sometimes days. Her physicians couldn't convince her to rest. Servants described her as lost in thought for hours, barely blinking, as though seeing things no one else could. And here's where the mystery begins. Because her physical symptoms weren't consistent with any one disease. There was no high fever, no rash, no coughing, no clear wound or accident. Just a slow, ghostly unraveling of the strongest woman in England. But whispers began to circulate, behind closed doors, in fire-lit rooms, among frightened courtiers. Some said she was poisoned, not by assassins, but by her own makeup. The lead-based white paint she used daily to maintain the illusion of her youthful image was now believed to be eating away at her from the inside. Lead poisoning causes confusion, fatigue, digestive issues, skin lesions, and eventual organ failure. It also affects the brain, often leading to hallucinations, depression, or withdrawal, all of which Elizabeth had been exhibiting. Could it be that in preserving her royal image, she was slowly killing herself? But there was another theory, a darker one, that Elizabeth wasn't dying of poison or age, but of grief. Historians have long speculated that she suffered from clinical depression, though the term didn't exist at the time. The deaths of her longtime advisors, Walsingham, Dudley, Essex, each left her more isolated. The betrayal and execution of the Earl of Essex, whom she may have loved, shook her deeply. The death of her confidante Lady Catherine was, perhaps, the final blow. By 1603, she was said to speak only in whispers. She rejected the presence of priests, refused to lie in bed, and reportedly kept candles lit at all hours, as though afraid of what the dark might bring. And then, one cold March morning, the queen who had survived plots, wars, and heartbreak simply stopped. No struggle, no drama, just stillness. Her body was embalmed and kept for weeks before burial, and no official autopsy was ever made public. Some say her death was caused by pneumonia. Others suggest streptococcus, but none of these account for the long decline, the silence, or the refusal to die in the royal bed. The truth may be something stranger, something that doesn't fit neatly into medical records. Elizabeth may have died from a life that demanded she never be fully human. She had no husband, no children, no equal. Her crown was her armor. And the moment she laid it down, there was nothing left to hold her together. This wasn't a death of blood or war. It was a death of weariness, of loneliness, of an age ending. And yet, her legend only grew stronger. She became Gloriana, The Golden Queen, the eternal symbol of England's rising power. Statues went up, plays were written, her image, once a mask, became a myth. But underneath all that, a woman, bone-tired, heartbroken, possibly poisoned by her own reflection. And so, the next time you see her face on a coin, or in a textbook, or carved in marble, remember not the crown, but the silence at the end. The queen who ruled the world, and died of being alone in it. Coming up in part 2. The curious rituals surrounding Elizabeth's embalming and funeral, and the secret political panic that followed her death. Because when a queen dies with no heir, history gets nervous. The queen was dead, and for days, no one dared say it aloud. In a palace of whispers and frost-bitten halls, her body lay still, hidden behind thick curtains, candles burning day and night to mask the odor of decay. They called it lying in state, but in truth, it was something closer to fear. Because Elizabeth had left no child, no written will, no clear successor. The Tudor line, the one that had clawed its way to power through blood and fire, was finished. And the kingdom, for the first time in 44 years, was leaderless. It's easy to forget, in our textbook view of history, just how precarious this moment was. England in 1603 was not a calm and peaceful place. It was surrounded by enemies. Spain still hated them. Ireland was restless. Scotland was watching, waiting. And inside the kingdom, there were Catholics hoping for a return of Rome, Protestants desperate to hold on to their gains, nobles with private armies, and commoners who didn't care about politics, only about the harvest. Now imagine all of that, with no monarch. So the Privy Council did what frightened men always do. They kept a secret. They delayed the public announcement of her death. For days, while her body cooled in Richmond Palace, they sent urgent messengers north, across rivers, through forests, galloping day and night toward one man, James VI of Scotland. Yes, that James, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, the woman Elizabeth had ordered executed years earlier. Irony doesn't begin to cover it. But James was the only viable heir. Protestant, royal blood, and crucially, a man. So even before England wept for its queen, the council moved to secure a king. They wrote carefully coded letters. Her Majesty has entered into everlasting rest. One read, and if that sounds vague, it was intentional. They feared Catholic uprisings, Spanish plots, ambitious nobles declaring themselves protector of the realm. One wrong move, and civil war could erupt before Elizabeth's body even reached its tomb. Meanwhile, back in Richmond, something stranger was happening. The royal embalmers, summoned in haste, reportedly worked in silence. No notes were kept, no official report made. Why? Because Elizabeth's body was difficult to preserve. She had already begun to decay. Some say she was too fragile to move. Others that the white lead on her skin had discolored her even in death, giving her a ghostly, almost unnatural appearance. So they packed her in spices and wrapped her in layers of cloth. No public viewing, no parade of grief, just silence. It wasn't until a full month later, on April 28, 1603, that her funeral was held. And even then, it wasn't about her. It was a show for the nation. A display of continuity, of order. Her coffin was covered in black velvet, topped with a lifelike effigy made of wood and wax. Dressed in royal robes, scepter in hand, crown on head. But those who stood close said something unsettling. The wax face melted slightly under the spring sun. It began to droop, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to disturb those already nervous about omens. The effigy wasn't just a symbol of majesty. It was a mask, hiding the fact that beneath it all, the real queen was gone. And no one yet knew what kind of king was coming. James arrived in London weeks later. He didn't attend her funeral. He was already holding court. He issued proclamations, took oaths, and smiled for the people, but in private. He was deeply aware of the woman he was replacing. Elizabeth had been a legend, and James was not. So he ordered her buried in Westminster Abbey, with full honors. He paid for a grand tomb. He instructed poets to eulogize her. Not because he admired her, but because it was politically necessary to honor the dead queen in order to be accepted as the new king. And just like that, the Tudor dynasty was over. A new age had begun. But something strange lingered. Because for all the pageantry, the poems, and the prayers, People remembered how she died, alone, without heirs, without closure, and a rumor began to spread that she had made a private confession on her deathbed, that she had named someone else, that the council had ignored it. Some even whispered she had changed her mind in the final hour, wanting to pass the crown not to James, but to someone closer, someone English. There was no evidence, of course, but there never is, with secrets that big. What we do know is that history moved quickly after her burial. Her portraits were taken down. Her coins were melted. Her favorites were exiled or absorbed. And within months, a new face appeared on banners, on thrones, on coins. James, the man who never met Elizabeth face to face. The man who owed his crown to her death. But in the shadows of Westminster, beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Abbey, Elizabeth still lies, wrapped in cloth, shrouded in myth, her tomb marked not by emotion, but by silence. A queen not killed by blade or poison, but by time. By loneliness. By a world that kept spinning after her story was done. And as people passed her monument in the centuries that followed, some would pause, not because of grandeur, but because of the absence. A woman who had been everything, now just stone, dust, and questions. Coming up in part 3. Elizabeth's war with mirrors, how she controlled her public image, outlawed unflattering portraits, and used fashion as a weapon of state. She may have ruled with words and wisdom, but Queen Elizabeth I also ruled with mirrors. Or rather, the absence of them. By the final decades of her life, mirrors were almost entirely banned from her royal residences. Servants whispered of vanishing glass. Foreign visitors noted how few reflective surfaces adorned her chambers. And those who dared bring up her appearance quickly found themselves removed from court. But this wasn't vanity, it was strategy. Because Elizabeth I understood something rulers today are only just learning: perception is power. And in a world where monarchs ruled by divine right, where kings lost thrones for looking weak, how the queen looked wasn't just personal, it was political. So she controlled it like a weapon. Let's rewind to the early years. Young Elizabeth, imprisoned in the Tower of London, learned early what image could mean. Her sister Mary, the reigning queen, saw Elizabeth not just as a rival, but as a symbol. A Protestant figurehead, a myth in the making. The people loved Elizabeth not for her power, but for her image of innocence, intelligence, and courage under fire. And Elizabeth never forgot that. So when she rose to power, she turned herself into an icon. Literally. She commissioned portraits that didn't show a woman, they showed an idea. A perfect face, ageless, emotionless, regal, the face of an immortal monarch. And then, she outlawed all the others. That's not exaggeration. In 1596, she issued a royal proclamation demanding that any unseemly portraits be destroyed, and that no artist could paint her without an official sketch approved by her council. Think about that. In a world without Instagram, without photography, without film, Elizabeth still managed to control her own media. With terrifying precision. Some call it early propaganda. Others call it genius. She knew that every image of her, hanging in noble halls or printed in books, would shape how the world saw her and how she ruled. And so, the image had to be flawless. But flawless comes at a price. By the 1590s, Elizabeth was in her 60s. Her hair had thinned. Her teeth were blackened from years of sugar and decay. Her skin had taken on the gray pallor of heavy lead-based makeup, which she used daily to cover up smallpox scars from earlier in life. She wore wigs so thick that servants had to pin them down with wire frames. Her dresses were so heavy they required assistants to move. And her shoes, delicate on the outside, were padded with fur to soothe her aching feet. To the world, she was still Gloriana. To her closest ladies-in-waiting, she was a ghost, held together by silk, powder, and ritual. But the illusion worked. Foreign ambassadors continued to report that the queen was as sharp as ever. Youthful in spirit, eternal in presence. Most had never seen her up close, and those who did were sworn to silence. Her portraits, the Darnley portrait, the Armada portrait, the Rainbow portrait, all show the same face. Smooth, pale, cold, godlike. In one, her eyes are massive, watching everything. In another, her hand rests on a globe, symbolizing global rule. In yet another, her dress is embroidered with eyes and ears, a reminder that nothing escaped her gaze. And behind the scenes? She was vetting everyone. One artist, Hilliard, once wrote that when painting Elizabeth, he was forbidden from showing shadows, because shadows implied depth, and depth implied age. Instead, she wanted light, flat, celestial, timeless. There's something tragic in that. A woman who had fought so hard to define herself, now erasing her own features to become a symbol. A queen not content to rule the present, but determined to control how the future would remember her. And in many ways, she won. Her official portraits still hang in palaces and museums, untouched by time. Schoolchildren recognize her ruff, her red wig, her calm, commanding stare. Most people forget the rot, the sickness, the silence. They remember the image, because that's how she planned it. In fact, one of her final recorded statements was to a clergyman who urged her to name a successor. She refused, but what she did say was, "I will have no earthly successor. My memory shall be my heir." That's not metaphor, that's legacy. She knew her body would fail. Her line would end, but the image, the one she'd sculpted, starved, polished, and painted, would survive. It would rule. And so it has. But there's something eerie in all this, too. Because what happens when a person becomes their own statue? When the mirror reflects not a face, but a myth? When history remembers the mask, but not the woman beneath it? Coming up in part 4. The men who tried, and failed, to marry Elizabeth I, a royal bachelorette, like no other. And the political game of love, betrayal, and thrones. She was the most powerful woman in Europe. And she never married. That alone makes Elizabeth I an anomaly in royal history. But what's stranger is how close she came, again and again, to doing it. To tying herself to kings, princes, suitors, traitors, and then backing away each time like a chess master refusing a bad move. She was called the Virgin Queen. But don't be fooled. Elizabeth's life was filled with romantic entanglements. Not just rumors, not just poetry, but full-blown diplomatic missions, marriage negotiations, and men who crossed oceans for her hand. And none of them succeeded. Let's start with the most famous, Robert Dudley. He was her childhood friend, her favorite, the one man she truly trusted. When she became queen, she made him master of the horse, a powerful court position that also meant he was near her constantly. Whispers flew through the palace like wildfire. She visited his private chambers. He was seen in hers. But there was a problem. Dudley was married, and then, his wife died. Mysteriously. She was found at the bottom of a staircase with a broken neck. No witnesses. No clear cause. The scandal was enormous. Elizabeth couldn't marry him now, not without half the kingdom thinking she'd plotted it. So she distanced herself, but never truly let him go. For decades, he remained at her side, even as she courted others. He remarried eventually, in secret. When Elizabeth found out, she was furious, not because of betrayal, but because he hadn't asked her permission. She saw all her suitors the same way, as pieces on a board. Another name. King Philip II of Spain. Yes, the same Philip who'd been married to her sister Mary. After Mary's death, Philip actually proposed to Elizabeth, partly to keep England under Spanish control. She strung him along for months. Told him she needed time. Said she'd pray on it. Consulted her counsel. And then, politely declined. It was a political ballet. Because Elizabeth knew something few women of her time did. That a queen who married risked becoming a consort, not a ruler. A husband, especially a foreign king, would expect to share power. And Elizabeth had no intention of sharing. So she danced with the Duke of Anjou, a French prince nearly 20 years younger. Their courtship lasted years. Love poems were exchanged. He visited England, even tried to learn English. At one point, Elizabeth called him her frog, a term of endearment. But when the English people rioted at the thought of a Catholic prince becoming king, she backed away again. Always close, never captured. She used marriage proposals like currency, a way to buy peace, secure alliances, or delay war. Even in her letters, she played the game. One to the Polish ambassador reads, "It is not fitting for a prince to act rashly, nor for a woman to make a vow before her mind is certain." It's cold, brilliant, terrifying, because it worked. For 44 years, Elizabeth ruled alone, no king by her side. No children to distract her court. No heirs to plot behind her back. She turned her singlehood into a strength. Painted herself as the bride of the nation. In one famous speech to Parliament, she said, "I am already bound unto a husband, which is the kingdom of England." It sounds poetic, but it was a threat. A warning that no man, not even the most royal, could come between her and the crown. But it came at a cost. In private, Elizabeth was lonely. She adored music, poetry, flirtation. She kept young courtiers around her like a solar system of pretty stars. She nicknamed them, teased them, demanded their attention, but none could get too close. When one, the Earl of Essex, became too bold, tried to manipulate her, even attempted a rebellion, she had him executed. And then locked herself away for days. Inconsolable. Because in the end, Elizabeth was human. She may have denied herself a husband, but she never stopped craving love. It just wasn't safe. Not for her. Not for the crown. So she wore her heartbreak like armor. Turned her lack of family into an image of divine purpose. Let people believe she was more than mortal, a virgin queen. Untouched. Incorruptible. Married only to her nation. And that myth became history. Today, we remember her not as a woman who never found love, but as one who didn't need it. But behind the myth, there are letters. Dozens of them. Long, aching, flirtatious, careful. Love, just out of reach. And in the end, she died alone. No spouse. No heir. No one to carry her name. Only a legacy, shaped not by who she married, but by who she didn't. Coming up in Part 5. The Cult of Death. How Elizabeth's funeral became a political theater. And how her tomb tells a story no textbook does. She ruled for 44 years. Faced invasions, plots, plagues, and betrayals. But what finally brought down Elizabeth I was silence. Not a sword, not a scandal, but a slow, creeping stillness that overtook her body and mind, until even her own courtiers didn't know what exactly was happening. It began in February 1603. The Queen, by now nearly 70, ancient by Tudor standards, had begun to withdraw. She stopped eating, refused her physicians, stood for hours at a time in silent thought. Her ladies-in-waiting described her as frozen in grief. But grief for what? Some say it was the death of Catherine Carey, her cousin and lifelong friend, who had passed weeks before. Others say it was the weight of old age, loneliness, and the collapse of the world she had built. Because by then, it was all falling apart. Her closest advisors were gone. The war with Ireland dragged on. The people whispered about her health. And Elizabeth, the master of image, the manipulator of myth, refused to be seen weak. So she shut herself away. In her palace at Richmond, she sat on cushions laid out on the floor, refusing to go to bed. For days and nights, she sat, not sleeping, not eating, just sitting, staring into the shadows. No one dared move her. The woman who once controlled the eyes and ears of a nation, now too afraid to be touched. Doctors were summoned. They begged her to rest. She refused. They prescribed her remedies, wine, tonics, herbs. She waved them away. She said nothing. Then came the fever. Still, she resisted. She wouldn't lie down, wouldn't change her clothes, wouldn't even speak her will. Her council grew panicked. There was no heir named, no official plan. The crown hung in the air, waiting to fall, and no one dared ask the Queen if it was time. Finally, after 4 days, she collapsed onto her cushions, breathing shallow, eyes vacant, the fire still roaring beside her. No ceremony, no royal announcement, just a body slowly folding inward. On March 24, 1603, around 3 a.m., Queen Elizabeth I died. No trumpets, no prayers, no grand declarations, just silence. And yet, the myth didn't die. Because immediately, the performance began. Her body was embalmed, then hidden away for weeks while the country transitioned power to King James of Scotland, her cousin's son, and the closest Protestant heir. Couriers rode in every direction. Ministers swore allegiance, but no one could quite believe it. The Queen, Gloriana, the Virgin, the Eternal, was dead? Not possible. So they turned her funeral into theater. On April 28, her coffin was paraded through London. Not in a wagon, but on a grand hearse drawn by 4 horses draped in black velvet. Their manes dyed pitch dark. The coffin was topped with a life-sized wax effigy of Elizabeth in full royal dress, with her scepter and orb, as if to say, "Even in death, she reigns." Tens of thousands watched. Some wept. Others cheered. Most stood in silence, unable to comprehend it. The woman who had defined an era, the last Tudor, was gone. But her image? That would live forever. The tomb erected for her in Westminster Abbey says more than most history books. It shows her lying in peace, not a corpse, but a saint, her hands folded, her face serene, marble smooth, ageless. Above her grave, Latin inscriptions call her Gloriana and Ever Virgin. And underneath, her sister, Queen Mary, the one who once imprisoned her, buried in the same vault. Two queens, two religions, two lives spent in rivalry, now lying together in the same stone bed. There's a cruel poetry in that. Elizabeth spent her entire reign controlling how she was seen. In portraits, in speeches, even in rumors. But death? Death levels everything. Or, does it? Because somehow, she pulled it off. Even now, over 400 years later, we talk about Elizabeth I not as a frail old woman who starved herself to death in a palace, but as a titan. A goddess, a queen above kings. She crafted a myth, lived inside it, died with it, and then became it. But here's a question worth asking. What if she wanted to disappear? What if her death, quiet, slow, unclaimed, was the final act of control? A queen choosing not to fade, but to vanish on her own terms? Coming up in Part 6. Conspiracies and Poisons. Could Elizabeth have been murdered? Or did her own legacy poison her from within? What really killed Elizabeth I? We've told the official story: depression, old age, grief, and exhaustion. The slow unraveling of a queen too proud to be seen dying. But whispers never really died. For over 400 years, theories have swirled, some poetic, some absurd, some disturbingly plausible. Let's start with one of the strangest. The Bisley Boy theory. It claims that Elizabeth was never Elizabeth. That the real princess died as a child in a small village called Bisley, while visiting with her caretakers. That the caretakers, terrified of King Henry VIII's wrath, secretly replaced the girl with a red-haired boy of similar age and features. And that he, trained to act like a girl, grew up to become Queen Elizabeth I. Ridiculous? Probably. But let's examine the evidence people point to. Elizabeth refused to allow physicians to examine her body, even in times of serious illness. She wore heavy makeup and wigs throughout her life. She never married. She kept her body hidden even from her most trusted ladies. No one ever saw her in a state of undress, not even her maids, who were trained to assist her while blindfolded or facing away. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe it was just how a powerful woman preserved mystery and power in a court full of backstabbers. Still, the rumor lingered. Now let's get darker. There's another theory: lead poisoning. The face paint Elizabeth used, that iconic white mask, was called Venetian ceruse. It was a mixture of vinegar and lead. She wore it for decades. Daily. Layer upon layer. And lead doesn't just sit on the skin. It absorbs. Slowly. Silently. Over years. It accumulates in the blood, brain, and bones. Symptoms? Fatigue, depression, hair loss, memory decline, insomnia, tremors, mood swings. Sound familiar? Because these were exactly the symptoms Elizabeth showed in her final years. She may have unknowingly poisoned herself in the name of beauty, in order to maintain the image of eternal youth and divine perfection. Now here's a twist. What if it wasn't unknowing? What if Elizabeth, watching her world collapse, chose to hasten her decline? To disappear on her own terms? To not die of politics, betrayal, or a weak succession, but of silence? Slowly swallowed by her own painted legend? There's one more theory, and it's political. Some historians have suggested that Elizabeth was pushed to death. Not violently, but through nudging. Her council, desperate for a peaceful transition, may have encouraged her to stop resisting sleep. To stop eating. Gentle manipulations, convincing her it was time. Removing stimuli, dimming lights, limiting visitors, all under the guise of comfort. Because her dying made things easier. It cleared the way for James VI of Scotland. It united England and Scotland under one crown. It ended the Tudor era cleanly, without rebellion or question. And the timing? Almost perfect. James had already begun secretly preparing to rule. His allies were already in London. Elizabeth hadn't named him outright, but everyone knew. They just needed her gone. Too convenient? Perhaps. Or perhaps the greatest manipulation of Elizabeth's life came not from the men she rejected, but from the men she trusted. But let's step back. Maybe the real cause wasn't a conspiracy, a switch, or a poison. Maybe it was legacy. The pressure of being a myth for too long. Of holding up a kingdom by sheer force of presence. Of becoming a symbol too great to remain human. Elizabeth outlived her enemies. Outplayed every suitor. Defeated the Spanish Armada. Crushed rebellion. But what no one teaches you is that power corrodes from within, not just without. She built an image too sacred to shatter. So she stopped being Elizabeth, long before she stopped breathing. And in the end, maybe that's what killed her. Not the crown, not the mask, not the secrets, but the silence between them. The silence that swallowed Gloriana whole, and left behind only legend. So now, centuries later, the question remains. Did she die as the last great queen? Or the last great prisoner of her own invention? Sleep well. History never really ends.